Ethan Cole was 18 years old, standing alone inside a crumbling country church he had just inherited, staring at a loose floorboard near the altar that shouldn't have been there. And what he would discover beneath it would force a powerful corporation to fight him, expose a secret his grandfather died protecting, and completely rewrite the story he had believed about being abandoned. But 12 hours earlier, Ethan had been standing on the cold marble steps of the Franklin County Administrative Building in Missouri with nothing but a faded backpack and a thin manila envelope handed to him by a polite caseworker who had already moved on emotionally before Ethan even opened it. Aging out of the foster system rarely came with ceremony. There were no balloons, no family photos, no sense of arrival, just paperwork and quiet goodbyes. Inside the envelope were the documents that now defined his entire adult life: a birth certificate, a state ID, a prepaid debit card with $312 on it, and a notarized property deed transferring ownership of an abandoned rural church outside the small farming town of Millbrook. The property had once belonged to Ethan's grandfather, Pastor Samuel Cole, a man Ethan had not seen since he was 6 years old and home. For the last 12 long years of foster homes and temporary placements, Ethan had quietly believed chose to disappear from his life. The morning air smelled like cold pavement and distant diesel trucks as Ethan leaned against the railing outside the building, trying to understand why someone who had supposedly walked away would leave him something at all, and why that something was a church that, according to the paperwork, had been closed for nearly a decade. His phone buzzed before he even finished reading the documents. The caller introduced himself in a calm, professional voice as an acquisitions manager for Trinity Development Group, speaking with the practiced friendliness of someone used to negotiating property deals. He explained that the company had recently become aware of Ethan's ownership of the old Hope Valley Church property and was prepared to offer him $9,500 for the land immediately. The building, he said gently, was structurally unsound and had been condemned years ago. The land itself, he added, would be far more useful if redeveloped. $9,500. To a teenager who had spent most of his life sharing bedrooms in group homes and worrying about where he would live after turning 18, it sounded like a fortune. It could mean a used car, a deposit on an apartment, maybe even a semester of community college. Ethan stared down the street at passing cars while the man continued explaining how simple the process would be. Just a few signatures, and the money would be wired within days. For a moment, Ethan almost agreed. But something about the situation bothered him. "I'm not selling," Ethan finally said, surprising even himself. "Not until I see it first." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line, just long enough to feel calculated. Then the man's friendly tone returned. "Of course," he replied smoothly, "but our offer won't remain open forever." The call ended, leaving Ethan alone with the wind pushing dust along the sidewalk. An hour later, he bought a one-way bus ticket to Millbrook. The ride took nearly 4 hours, passing miles of winter fields and quiet towns that seemed to exist halfway between yesterday and tomorrow. When the bus finally dropped him off beside a small gas station on the edge of Millbrook, the town looked like many small American farming towns, stubbornly holding on to its routines. A diner with a faded sign advertising homemade pie, a feed store with rusted metal silos behind it, pickup trucks parked along Main Street as if they had been there since the 1990s. Ethan borrowed directions from a cashier who raised an eyebrow when he mentioned the church. "That old place," the woman said. "Thought nobody owned it anymore." The church sat 5 miles outside town along a narrow gravel road lined with leafless oak trees. By the time Ethan reached the property line, the late afternoon sky had turned pale gray and the wind had picked up. The building appeared slowly through the trees. A small wooden church with peeling white paint and a tall steeple that leaned slightly to one side, like it had grown tired of standing upright. The front doors hung crooked on rusted hinges, and the once bright, stained glass windows were cracked and faded. A weathered wooden sign still stood near the road, barely readable beneath years of sun and rain. "Hope Valley Church." Ethan stepped out of the car and listened. The silence was almost unsettling. No traffic, no voices, just the wind brushing against the dry grass. He pushed the front doors open, and they groaned loudly as if the building itself had not expected visitors. Inside, dust drifted through narrow beams of light coming from the broken windows. The rows of pews sat crooked and abandoned. The old piano near the front was missing several keys. The altar stood empty beneath a wooden cross, darkened with age. This, Ethan realized slowly, was what his grandfather had left him, a collapsing church miles from anywhere. He walked slowly down the aisle, boots echoing against the wooden floor. Anger rose quietly in his chest. If Samuel Cole had cared about him at all, why had he never come back? Why leave him here instead? Ethan dropped his backpack near the front pew and sat down heavily, staring at the cracked ceiling above him while the wind rattled the stained glass. Night arrived quickly in the countryside. By the time darkness settled around the church, the temperature had dropped sharply. Ethan used his phone flashlight to explore the rest of the building. 2 small offices behind the altar, a narrow hallway leading to a storage room, and a staircase that once descended to what looked like an old basement but was now blocked by collapsed boards. Eventually, he returned to the sanctuary and laid down across a pew, using his backpack as a pillow. The wind moved through the broken windows with a low, restless whistle. Somewhere in the building, a loose board creaked every few minutes like something shifting in the dark. Ethan stared at the ceiling, thinking about the phone call and the money he had turned down. By morning, he told himself he would probably accept the offer and walk away from this place forever. But just after sunrise, while pacing near the altar and debating whether to make the call, his boot struck a plank in the floor that shifted with a hollow sound beneath it. Ethan stopped immediately. He stepped back and tapped the board again with his heel. The same hollow thud echoed under the wood. Slowly, he knelt down and ran his fingers along the edges of the plank. One corner lifted slightly when he pressed it. The floorboard came loose with a dry scraping sound, revealing a dark metal ring embedded in a square wooden hatch hidden beneath the church floor. Ethan stared at it for a long moment, his pulse beginning to quicken as a strange thought crept into his mind. Maybe the church wasn't the real inheritance after all. Maybe whatever was hidden under it was. Ethan Cole stood in the silent sanctuary of the abandoned Hope Valley Church, staring down at the square wooden hatch hidden beneath the loose floorboards, the metal ring still swaying slightly in his hand, and a strange uneasiness settled in his chest as he realized the crumbling building might not be the real inheritance his grandfather had left him. The hatch resisted at first, sealed by years of dust and warped wood, but when Ethan pulled harder, it lifted with a long, rusty groan, and a breath of cool air drifted up from the darkness below. He leaned over and shined his phone flashlight into the opening, revealing a narrow wooden ladder descending into a hidden chamber beneath the church. For a moment he hesitated, unsure what he expected to find. Maybe an old storage cellar. Maybe nothing at all. But something about the careful way the hatch had been hidden made it clear the space below had been meant to stay secret. Slowly he climbed down, each step creaking softly, until his boots touched the concrete floor. When the beam of light swept across the room, Ethan froze. The space wasn't messy or abandoned like the church above. It was organized. Metal shelves lined the walls, filled with labeled boxes, folders, and sealed containers. A wooden desk sat in the center, covered with journals, cassette recorders, and stacks of documents. On one wall hung a large county map marked with colored pins and handwritten notes. It looked less like a basement and more like a research archive. Ethan opened the nearest binder and began flipping through the pages. Inside were property records, newspaper clippings, and detailed notes documenting land purchases across Franklin County over more than a decade. Farms, warehouses, and small historic buildings had quietly been bought through different shell companies. But one name kept appearing again and again in the records: Trinity Development Group, the same company that had called him offering money for the church. A knot tightened in Ethan's stomach as he realized his grandfather hadn't just been saving old paperwork. He had been investigating something. Sitting alone on the desk was a small cedar box with 2 words carved neatly into the lid: Ethan Cole. Ethan opened it slowly and found a thick notebook and a folded letter. The handwriting on the letter was immediately familiar from the birthday cards his grandfather used to send. It explained how failing health and financial problems had forced Samuel Cole to give up custody years ago. A decision, he wrote, had broken his heart. Ethan lowered the letter, anger still rising despite the explanation. For 12 years he had believed the man had simply walked away. He turned instead to the notebook. Page after page detailed Trinity Development's land purchases, slowly forming a pattern across the county along an abandoned underground rail tunnel. Near the final pages, the writing became urgent. If Trinity gained ownership of Hope Valley Church, they would control the last piece of land needed to secure the entire tunnel route. Ethan stared at the final line written across the last page. Do not sell the land until you know the truth. He looked around the hidden room again, the maps, the recordings, the carefully gathered evidence, and slowly understood that the church his grandfather had left him wasn't worthless at all. It was the one piece standing between a powerful corporation and a plan worth millions. And now that Ethan had found the secret room beneath the church, he realized something else just as clearly. If Trinity discovered what was hidden there, they wouldn't just want the land anymore. They would want the evidence, and the only person who knew where it was. Ethan sat alone in the hidden room beneath Hope Valley Church for a long time, staring at the maps, recordings, and notebooks his grandfather had spent years collecting, slowly realizing that the abandoned building above him was never the real inheritance. This truth was. By the time he climbed back up through the hatch and stood again in the dusty sanctuary, the morning light was pouring through the cracked stained glass, and the church no longer felt empty. It felt watched. Within hours, Ethan drove into Millbrook and walked into the small law office on Main Street, carrying the letter and the notebook in his backpack. The attorney who agreed to meet him, Margaret Doyle, had practiced law in the county for more than 30 years, and as she read through the documents, her calm expression slowly shifted into something sharper. When she finally looked up, she tapped the notebook lightly with her pen. Your grandfather wasn't just keeping records, she said. He was building a case. Over the next few weeks, they began quietly filing legal protections for the documents and recordings Samuel Cole had hidden beneath the church. That was when the pressure started. First, the town water department claimed there had been a clerical error and temporarily shut off the water line running to the church property. Then a rumor spread through town that Ethan planned to sell the land anyway. One evening, a black SUV rolled slowly into the church parking lot, and the same acquisitions manager who had called Ethan stepped out, his voice calm and polite as ever. You're young, the man said, glancing up at the leaning steeple. Legal fights like this can become very expensive. Ethan met his gaze without stepping back. Then it's a good thing the truth is worth more than $9,000, he replied. What happened next took months. Reporters began asking questions once Margaret Doyle shared pieces of the investigation with state regulators. The records Samuel Cole had gathered revealed that Trinity Development Group had quietly been buying properties across the county to secure control of an underground rail corridor for private freight development. The church land was the final piece they needed. Without it, their plan stalled. Eventually, the company backed away from its aggressive purchase campaign. An illegal agreement was reached preserving the church property as protected land, while the evidence Samuel had collected remained part of a larger investigation into the company's business practices. The victory wasn't dramatic. There were no shouting matches in courtrooms or headlines across national newspapers. Just signatures on documents and a quiet acknowledgement that the old pastor had been right to question what powerful people were doing behind closed doors. That spring, volunteers from Millbrook began helping Ethan repair the church. Broken windows were replaced. The roof was patched. Fresh white paint slowly covered the weathered boards. One warm morning, Ethan stood outside, watching the sunlight hit the steeple as a new bell was lifted into place. Margaret Doyle stood beside him, arms folded as she looked up at the building. Your grandfather believed this place mattered, she said quietly. Ethan nodded, thinking about the years he had spent believing a completely different story about the man who raised him. For most of his life, he had believed he'd been abandoned. Now he understood something far more complicated and far more powerful. Samuel Cole hadn't left him with money or comfort. He had left him with the truth and the courage to protect it. The church wasn't just an old building anymore. It was proof that sometimes the things that look forgotten on the surface are the ones carrying the deepest foundations underneath. And sometimes the inheritance that changes your life the most is the one hidden where only you were meant to find it.